Welcome to Rocking Our Prize. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Evans. Now, here's a question. Why is religiosity so strong across the Middle East and North Africa? Was this due to bottom-up religious associations, or was it led by the state? Today, I'm joined by Harvard Professor Malika Zeghal to discuss her fantastic new book, The Making of the Modern Muslim State, Islam and Governance in the Middle East and North Africa. Malika, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans, for having me.
Oh, please call me Alice. Right, okay. So now here is a question. In Catholic Europe and Latin America, churches were independently wealthy and they owned vast swathes of land. Was that same balance of power true in the Middle East and North Africa? How independently rich were mosques and madrasas?
That's a great question. It looks like, from my research, that the religious institutions were, in general, mainly funded by state actors and rulers. It doesn't mean that ulama did not receive waqfs and other types of funding from civil society. But from the research I've been able to do, it looks like the state has been one very significant actor financing religious institutions. In the modern period, and I mean the 19th and 20th centuries in the Middle East, is the existence of a very important duty for the state. And this duty is what I call the custodianship of Islam as a preferred religion. And this means that the state has, as one of its duties, it's not the only duty that the state has, the duty to preserve the religion, Islam, the Muslim community, and Islamic institutions. And this duty is tied to sovereignty. Even if it is exercised, for instance, by a non-Muslim ruler, let's talk about the French in Tunisia or in Algeria or Morocco, they all had to respond to that duty. And as I said, it's only one of the state's duties, which means that the state is not only a religious state. It has a religious quality, but it has to also do a lot of secular things. And this is important for how this custodianship evolves in the 19th and 20th century. And yes, as Kourou says, there is a relationship between the ulama and the state. And I don't call it an alliance, I call it a partnership. And this custodianship, it is performed through a state partnership with ulama, but this partnership is always ambivalent. It's always very tense. And that's true all over the Islamic history. I mean, we find, in chronicles, ulama not wanting to be appointed judges. Why? Because they're going to have to compromise with the political power, with the ruler, etc. And so there is also, of course, this duty that has to come from the ulama to speak power, to speak truth, to the power, and say the truth and call the ruler to justice. But of course, firepower is in the hands of the rulers, so they all often have the upper hand. But still, the ulama have this duty, this moral duty, and sometimes they are able to constrain the ruler. So I find that this custodianship of Islam as a preferred religion is something that has happened continuously through history, but that it has taken many different forms, right? And there have been very vigorous debates about how to do it. And I pay attention to the legal instantiations of that custodianship through the constitutional history of the modern Middle East, through Tunisia, which has a very long constitutional history and is very interesting because you have the great diversity of contexts, right? Pre-colonial, colonial, authoritarian, democratic, with a return to authoritarianism. So you can look at that, at these discussions, these disputes, what you brilliantly call the fist fight, right? About how we should implement this and what it means. And then I look at, the financial support that the state gives to religious institutions.
Okay, so I still wanted to ask you about that fist fight because, so I think you made so many interesting claims. And so one is that even as modernizing reformists, the Pahlavi, Nasser, Turks, pushed for liberalizing reforms, you say that all of them agreed on the centrality of this custodianship. Can you tell me more about the scope of those constitutional debates? Why do you think that they're, because I think it's so interesting, clearly there is a spectrum, right? Why do you think, for example, that in Tunisia they were going further along towards secularism than, say, Egypt, for example? In Tunisia they were so much more inspired by the Tanzimat reforms. What do you think explains that heterogeneity?
So how do we compare Egypt and Tunisia in terms of, what you call secular reform? So, for instance, if I look at constitutions, in the 20th century constitutions of Tunisia, Sharia never appears, right, as a source of legislation, but it appears in Egypt. For me, looking at the debates in both countries, it means that the conservative constituency became, in the second half of the 20th century, much stronger than in Tunisia, for instance. So it's a question of where the divide between the liberals and the conservatives is going to end up, right? And in the case of Tunisia, for instance, in the 19th century, for the first constitution, Sharia was extremely important, right? And in fact, it was part of the constitutional narrative. So the Tunisians imported new techniques of governance, such as notions of equality, regardless of religion. And because they did that, they had to reaffirm the importance, the centrality of Sharia law. But you do not see Sharia law reappear in the final text of constitutions in the 20th century, in the 1959 constitution or in the 2014 constitution. The 2022 constitution is a little bit hybrid. I can say a little bit more about that. But Bourguiba did not want this to happen, and Nasser did not make it happen at the time, right? So they are very comparable. But what happens is that in the 70s, the conservative constituency in Egypt pushes a lot the Muslim Brothers, but also the conservative ulama. And this is where also I bring in the ulama who are usually not bundled with the Islamists. There are conservative ulamas who have affinities with the Islamists, especially in Egypt. So I would say that the conservative constituency is simply, stronger in Egypt in the second half of the 20th century.
Sorry, just to clarify, but
yes.
So I really liked, I don't know if I'm sure you've read it, the Al-Masri's book on Tunisia and Arab anomaly. And he makes the case that Tunisia was always becoming much more secular, like it always had much more secular reforms, like in even the Sadiqi College, etc. Wasn't there as a whole legacy of Tunisia sort of, I don't know whether that's sort of the very strong French push for secularism, something in the colonial engagement, or wasn't Tunisia always more secular?
I always had difficulties to develop such a comparison. What is the metric? And this is why I used state religious expenditures to look at that. So let me just give you the 2022, the new constitution of 2022, compared to the constitutions before. Yeah. And also, let's talk about the 2014 constitution. The word Sharia doesn't appear in the 2014 constitution because Ghannouchi, the leader of the Islamist party Al-Nahda, decided apparently in a democratic way within his own party to accept that Sharia would not be enshrined in the constitution. But what I found in the discussions, the constitutional drafting discussion, was that the Islamists also very clearly said that for them, Article 1, which stated that Tunisia's religion is Islam, was sufficient for them to understand that Sharia had to be implemented. And they looked at future legislation in a democratic context as a way to just do that. So it's not because Sharia is not in the constitution that, in fact, the country is more secular or less religious than others. It's very important, of course, to look at the text of constitutions, but also to look at the constitutional debates, to look at the tug of war between conservatives and and liberals. And in fact, liberals in Tunisia would tell you that Tunisia has become too conservative. There is too much Islam, too many mosques, too much Sharia law, etc. Right? Sharia law is still implemented when it comes to inheritance, for instance. So I find those comparisons a little bit complicated, too complicated to be entirely convincing.
Okay, so let's go back. So that's a really good point. How do we compare countries in terms of religiosity? Yeah. And to take one of your tables, so you've got a fantastic table which looks at the share of higher education students in Islamic tracks. And that's much, much higher in Egypt than, say, Tunisia. Like, I think in Egypt, you show that 10% of higher education students are studying Islam, whereas in Tunisia, it's much lower. And I think another really interesting example that perhaps we could talk more about is how within, and you've written about this in previous work, how within Tunisia, there was a very specific shift that it's not just focusing on expanding religious education, but the kind of religious thought that was taught about understanding Islam in a more historical context rather than this is Sunni orthodoxy and we're all going to be instructed in Sunni orthodoxy. That seemed like the textbook seemed quite different between Tunisia and Egypt, for example.
Yes. So the figures are a great way to compare. Of course, surveys would be, but surveys are always complicated. And content and substance of what is taught is very important. So just to go back to the percentage of Muslim student enrollments in specialized Islamic tracks, right? Meaning the madrasas or the modern instantiations of madrasas such as Al-Azhar or the Imam Khatib schools, Ilahiyat in Turkey, etc. What we see is that, first of all, in the 19th century, there is a very, very rapid decrease of those enrollments. Why? Because modern education, which teaches modern knowledge imported from Europe, is developed at a good pace. And then we see around, I'm looking at my graph here, around the 1960s, we see that these enrollments have become very small everywhere, right? So we could call it the secularization of education, but be careful that we're not looking at Islamic instruction in modern schools here, only at a very particular way to sustain Islamic education, which is the madrasa. Right?
Yeah, I should interrupt and maybe tell the listeners who haven't read your book that so maybe let's do a quick summary of the data that you present. At the back of your book, and this is it's a gold mine and I love it. You track a number of outcomes. So one is the state expenditure on religion, two, the number of hours of Islamic schooling that any one child is likely to do at any given period across Tunisia, across Egypt, across Turkey. And also then you look at people who are in specialized Islamic tracks. So you're looking at both the number of hours of Islamic instruction that you're getting if you're in modern state schooling and how many people are going into these specialized tracks. So you look at all this change over time, both in terms of bums on seats and in terms of state expenditure. On top of it, you're looking at state expenditure, for example, as a percentage of GDP, how much states invest in education, in religion, and also the net volume, the absolute figures. So sorry, I should just explain that all.
No.
Right, yeah. So it's amazing. It's amazing. And we'll dig into the methodology. Right, yeah. So tell us more about these tables.
So going back to madrasa education, what I call the specialized Islamic tracks, what we see then in the 1990s, starting in the 1990s, we see like an increase, modest but important increase. I mean, it's a little bit more than 10% around 2010 of those enrollments in Egypt. This is Al-Azhar, right? And in fact, it starts in the 1990s. And when I realized that, this was exactly where, when I was in Egypt doing my fieldwork, studying Al-Azhar and its ulama, right? So this was the moment where you had this. And so, of course, it happens also in Turkey, and it fluctuates. But what this means is that when the state supports Islamic education, it can do it either through modern schooling or through madrasa schooling. Now, the bulk of that Islamic education, nonetheless, is given in modern schools. So modern schools has really taken the place of madrasas, although some regimes like to show their attention to that traditional form of education for legitimacy purposes, for instance, or, to cajole the ulama against the Islamists. So there are plenty of different reasons why they would want to do that, but it is part of the custodianship. And this custodianship can be done practically without madrasa education, as in Tunisia. Tunisia has like a very, very small number of enrollees in the Zaytuna. And, in fact, when Bourguiba took over to talk about, those so-called secular or secularist leaders, I would call him more like liberal progressive, because he never wanted to separate a religion and state, or didn't want even neutrality of the state toward religion. What he did is that he slashed the expenditures, the religious expenditures and the enrollments at the Zaytuna. And he even argued that, the French had given too much funds and too much attention to the traditional type of education, right? So he was very much anti-clerical at the time, one could say, but not anti-Muslim. So the state custodianship continued.
Okay, so I have a question. Why do you think so we mentioned that for example, you show in some of your tables that during the 1950s, 1960s in Turkey, that state expenditure was relatively low as a percentage of GDP.
Yes.
Why do you think the liberalizing reformists lost the battle?
So if we talk about losing the battle as not being able to, get to a very not a very munificent state custodianship, meaning not spending too much. Yes, there is, in a way, a failure. But I think these things, they come and go, right? So if you look at the trying to get to my GDP, the state religious expenditure as a percentage of GDP graph, you see the reforms of Ataturk in the 1940s, right? These expenditures, they go like quasi-zero, right? But then you see them at 1% of GDP right before Sisi takes over, and then they decline. So if you call failure the failure to disengage completely financially, yes. Why? Because there is a preference, there is a choice, that it is expected that the state has this duty to be the custodian of Islam as a preferred religion, right? So if there is failure from that point of view, is the failure to separate or to become neutral, yes. And why? I haven't been able to answer this question. I have looked at possible factors, why does it happen? And in fact, I find that GDP per capita, I find that years of schooling, political rights do not seem to be significant factors explaining that, right? And so I don't have an explanation of why it continues, whether it is low or high. And I know it fluctuates, but for me, it's a choice, it's a preference. And the fact that we have exceptions to, the existence of a state-preferred religion, in the Muslim world as a whole, in Muslim-majority countries, tell me that it's not something inevitable. It can change, right? Especially if discussions are opened about how we do it and why we do it. We've seen those discussions during the Arab Spring, but usually these discussions are very muffled. They're very much happening under the table. And so people are not really continuing that discussion, especially after the return of authoritarianism after the Arab Spring.
Okay, let me take another indicator, another comparable indicator to think about this battle, this fistfight. So if we take in Turkey, in Iran, in Egypt, many of those modernizing reformists banned the hijab, for instance, right? So whether it's banned in jobs, banned on the streets, etc.
Yeah.
So there were these state-imposed bans on the hijab as part of getting Islam out of the public sphere, right? But that battle certainly seems to have lost, right? Right. So, in Iran, clearly, right? Mm-hmm. So, but also in Egypt and in Turkey and in earlier, as you said, in Tunisia. So why do you think, what led to that rise in veiling, for example? Like, how much would you credit, say, other explanations like economic stagnation, that's well discussed in the literature on Egypt, people's frustrations, rulers then cloaking themselves in Islam to gain legitimacy, or how heavily would you weight another factor like Saudi funding and the global spread of Salafism? Like, how would you weight those different factors in some of those cultural practices we see?
Okay, so the revival of the 1970s, we see, in the expenditures from time to time. There are also other things that will really contradict your priors when it comes to revivals before that. So in the 60s, you see an increase in Egypt in terms of state religious expenditures under Nasser. Exactly why? Because he develops Al-Azhar. I mean, the enrollments are also going to explode later. So the hijab itself. So Bourguiba never really banned legally the hijab. I don't think Nasser did. They simply pushed towards taking off the hijab, and this is what you see. But what you see also is women, uh, you know, uh, taking on the hijab again later. So what are the explanations? For me, it's part of the fist fight, right? It's part of the tug of war between the liberals and the conservatives. And of course, it comes not just from within, it comes from without. And so these are battles for influence, right, for cultural influence. And today, when you go to the Middle East, it's very different from the 1960s. Women are veiled, but also women participate more to the labor market. They're more in the public square. They go to school. And so it is perhaps because they participate more and they're more in the public eye that they cover themselves, right? And it also, works, in a fashion-like thing. I mean, the hijab is not necessarily a sign of religiosity. It might be a sign of other things. And in the beginning, in fact, when it starts in the 70s to develop, it is, before anything else, I think, a political signal, right? And it is the Islamist groups who push towards that new type of sartorial choice, which is not entirely new because, as everything else, it comes and goes, right? So I don't have an explanation except, this cultural war that happens in the Middle East and that we can see, happening as we speak. I mean, under our eyes. There are also, other interesting things that are happening. For instance, in Tunisia, there are groups of young people who are trying to push for the possibility of eating in public during Ramadan, right? So these are very small groups, but you can see the discussion, evolving, going on, and changing in terms of, how people think about it.
Okay, so I want to ask a question. So you're saying that there's this state increase in funding over time for religion specific and also religious instruction in schools. I want us to discuss an alternative hypothesis, and that goes back to more bottom-up religious associations. So there's been a lot of literature on, say, religious club goods, and the Islamic revival was led by these bottom-up clubs, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood. What do you make of that explanation, that it's nothing to do with the state, that even if the state is expending on religion, maybe that's just a reaction to all that bottom-up demand for piety?
Yeah. So it's very possible that, when those expenditures as a percentage of GDP fluctuate, it is, of course, in reaction to a demand, right? But it also feeds that demand, right? So that's the problem. Where does it come from, right? So that's the problem. Association. So there are two aspects to associations. There is the cultural war, right? And associations, of course, they can do a lot of things from a moral normative point of view. So they can push for veiling, for instance, right? Like, let's say an Islamic private clinic can say to women, well, you can come in, but you have to be veiled, right? So there is, of course, social pressure that is put there, and associations can play culturally a very important role. Now, from the financial point of view, what I discovered is that they don't play such an important role. So, for instance, I found that in Egypt between 1960 and 2017, if I take out user fees and state aid, well, they represent 4% of state religious expenditures, right? So it's rather small. Now, there's a lot of advertising or publicity, a lot of noise about those associations as being a threat because they would, in fact, provide public religious provisions, right? But I don't see much there, right? So my impression is that they're probably very strong culturally from a normative point of view. Maybe they give a little bit, but they don't give that much, right?
So they don't give
Yeah.
much. So when you're saying that the religious associations aren't providing many member benefits or clubs or services.
Exactly. However, they might be very influential from a cultural point of view and play a role in this tug of war between liberals and conservatives. Yeah.
Right. So they're noisy, but materially they're pretty small.
Exactly.
And that brings me on. Let's just go back historically. That you have this fantastic and fascinating engagement with the vast literature, and I mispronounce it every time, so you need to correct me. Waqfs. Always say it wrong. How do I pronounce it again?
Waqf.
Waqfs.
Waqf. Yeah, I think you
Waqfs.
pronounce it well.
I know.
Yeah.
I do not do it. Anyway, so Timur Karat and many others, they extending this point on religious associations, they say, the Middle East and North Africa fell behind because these Islamic legal institutions, they impeded market capitalism because the prescriptions were laid down by the founders, which then subsequent caretakers had to follow. And they had various strict stipulations saying preventing any kind of managerial autonomy, preventing any room for maneuver. And you engage with that idea. And honestly, I found it so fascinating. Can you share that aspect with us?
Yeah. So there is this assumption in the literature that the waqfs in the past were enormous as a form of property, and that they provided enormous amounts of public religious provisions. And you find that in the historiography, and you find that also in the sources. And my suspicion is that a lot of what you find in the sources has in a way translated into the historiography in a way that might have been a little bit uncritical. So the issue of the impact of the waqf as a form of the legal form of property also is quite thought-provoking. I find it extremely interesting. But what I say in the book is that, in fact, the waqf were not that enormous in terms of acreage, but also in terms of the amount of public religious provisions that they provided. For just to give you an example, for Tunisia, it is often said that 1/3 of Tunisia was in waqfs. And I discovered that this went back to a work published in French in the end of the 19th century that also said that, yes, this was the figure that was given, but one had to be extremely cautious because it was hearsay, right? But then those words of caution have been completely forgotten by the historiography, and in particular in the Encyclopedia of Islam that has repeated that assumption, right? And in fact, when I looked more closely at it, I looked at historians' work, but also some other sources, I realized that it might have been around in the 18th century. For instance, Lucette Valency, the great historian of Tunisia, showed that, based on, again, it's always patchy, so this is why we have to be very careful. But she took a representative sample of localities and she found the number of 10%. Right? Which is very different from 1/3, right? So if we're going to give such an impactful power to the waqfs, we have also first to look at the empirics, right? How much this represent and how much in terms of public provision. So the other thing is that, between public and private also, we need to make sure we understand that usually private waqfs were quite important. And in fact, so they had private beneficiaries such as the family. And of course, after the extinction of the lineage, it would go to a charitable aim. But many of those waqfs had private beneficiaries. And even, the public waqfs were used as social props, as Gabriel Bauer has shown it, right? Although he didn't quantify it. So we have a lot of data that seem to suggest that we should be much, much more careful about what the waqfs represented. Now, did this form of property stifle growth and creativity? I don't know. But what I see in the sources is that public waqfs were used by those who manage them and by the state as very flexible means to finance public religious provision. So
yeah,
you see,
this I found
yes,
so mind-blowing, because the whole point, the whole objection was that all these waqfs have such strict stipulations, you can't move money around. And then in your book you're saying, they're moving money
yes,
here and there.
so exactly. So this is what I found. They're moving the money around. They reprioritize things, whenever they need it. And this is the message of the book, which is that the state comes to the rescue of religious institutions, whatever the forms. When the waqfs are not working anymore, and why are they not working anymore? Because people do not fund waqfs anymore. That's it. Rulers do not do it anymore. Civil society doesn't do it anymore. So they're not there. So, the state comes in and gives cash, directly to the ulama, right? And so what's happening here is that there are a lot of reprioritizations. I have a story that I find myself quite delightful, which is that in the 1840s, during the Tanzimat in Tunis, when the Madrasa Zaytuna was being reformed, the Bey created a new class of professors called second class professors, and he needed money. And so what he did is that he took the surpluses of waqfs that were destined to the recitation of prayers in praise of the Prophet in the madrasa itself. He left 2 reciters, but he took the rest to pay those professors of the second class. And in the chronicle I was reading, it is said, and I think this is where where it is delightful, is that the chronicler says, little by little, the prayers were forgotten, and the 2 professors who recited them joined the second class of professors, right? So it is quite interesting to see how it was easy to reprioritize the waqf. The waqfs were used even before that time, even before the 19th century. There are mentions in the chronicles that it could be used to wage jihad. So you could take, in case of necessity, some revenues of the awqaf and put that in the army because you had this urgent necessity to wage a war, right? So what I found in the end, is that yes, of course, there are agency problems, right? It's not completely a marketable form of property, but still there were many ways to circumvent that and make this thing work.
Another point I found so fascinating in your book about waqfs is that you were saying, one of Timur Karan's argument is that waqfs impeded civil society mobilization because each family or unit focused on their waqf, where you're saying that actually so many of the waqfs, even those that existed, were actually funded by the ruling family.
Yes, the public waqfs, right? They were in their majority funded by ruling families. So this is where you see also throughout history the role of the state. Yes, definitely.
And this brings me to my first question. Why weren't mosques and madrasas able to self-fund? So to give the European example, both in Europe and in Latin America, churches might own vast swathes of land. Or they might have some kind of side business. They were collecting rents from tenants or something like that. Why weren't mosques independently wealthy? Why couldn't they generate their own revenue?
I have no answer to that, except to say that rulers and people of large means, being very close to rulers, were the ones funding those waqfs, and perhaps this was enough. So I don't have a hypothesis
because in Europe and in for example, to give Ireland for example, vast swathes of Ireland were owned by the church. In France, in Mexico, in Peru, in Chile, large swathes of land were owned by the church, and it was only with the ecclesiastical reforms in Spain in the 1830s, or with the Gustav Vasa in Sweden, that they with the Protestant Reformation, that they took up the churches. The European rulers had to kneecap the churches and steal all their assets. So I just wonder, how is it that the church got wealthy in Europe and they had independent power, and of course that independent wealth enabled the churches to provide goods to their people and to gain legitimacy. And I just wonder why. And you know, in Europe, people might, you know, bequeath land to the church when they died, for instance, or they might pay
Mm-hmm.
tithe. And of course, Muslims are paying zakat, etc. But I just wonder why the mosque didn't have more money, because they do
So,
today. So let me just give you an example. East London Mosque here in the UK will get £9,000, which is what, I don't know, $12,000 per
mm-hmm.
week in collections. $12,000 a week, right? Quite a lot of money just for one mosque to collect a week. And I don't know, it just seems interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting question. You know, there is no church. That's perhaps one element to think about. But I don't have an answer to the question, the comparison.
Okay.
Yeah.
But now, okay,
Yeah.
let's talk about this data, of collecting all this data, right? Going back, how confident can we be about how much money the state was spending on religion, or who was spending it on what, before the 20th century?
What do you mean? How comfortable?
Oh, well, you know, so for example, I found it so fascinating where you were giving that story that the source was based on hearsay from the French, right? And there
Yes.
must be
Yes.
so many sources like this person has said this, and
Mm-hmm,
how
mm-hmm.
can we how confident can we be
Oh,
about, you
okay.
know, how many Waqfs there were and who was spending on what?
So, in terms of Waqfs, um, we can be confident when we have accounts. So we have to be very careful about, of course, the superficie and things like that. But when it comes to spending, whenever I found accounts, I used them. So, for instance, starting in 1875, I could use the accounts of the state administration that centralized the Awqaf, right? And here you have very comprehensive accounts. When it comes to direct payments by the state, one has to look at central budgets, right? And this is what I did. I collected very fine-grained central state budgets. And I went as far as 1730. That's one point. I studied in Tunisia because I found a central state budget, which is extremely interesting. So there is very little, for instance, that you can find paid to religion directly through this central state budget, but the number of lines is much higher than, you know, the numbers we find in money. And, you know, it is quite something that is symbolic in the sense that the budget itself performs the state custodianship of Islam, right? So you have lines of 1 piaster for, let's say, the Sufi here, for someone who comes back from Mecca and brings some blessed water to the bay, right? You also find a little bit of money to a kuteb for girls and a kuteb for boys, right? Which shows also the attention that the bay pays to education, not just for boys, but also for girls. And I was quite stunned to find that. So, yes, you have some documents that you can use. And when you don't have the documents and you don't have the accounts, you can also triangulate, right? And use the serious economic history that has been done also before us by historians of the Middle East. It's not easy, right? And so, of course, we're more comfortable looking at a budget of, you know, from the year 2025, right? Especially that the awqaf are usually embedded into that central state budget. It's all very easy, right? But before, we have to take the budgets of the madrasas when you find them, plus the budgets of the awqaf when you find them, plus the budget of the central state. So if I were to go back in history to continue that work, well, it will be even more challenging than what I have done here, right? But this doesn't mean that we can not try to make, you know, broad economic reasonings and try to get to the bottom of it, right? And hopefully, you know, economic historians working on the pre-modern Muslim state will be able to do that.
I have a question. Going back to 18th century Tunisia, what do you think religious education was like then? I mean, because in a sense, every mosque would have performed some form of madrasa. Like after the Maghrib prayers, there might be something like, you know, providing informal instruction in the Quran. Like how much religious knowledge of, say, fiqh jurisprudence was there in
So
villages?
in terms of knowledge, in the bigger, you know, city madrasa, of course, you will find interesting ulama who would write what they write and teach what they teach in their circles of knowledge. Now, in terms of Quranic education, we have very little in terms of enrollments. We don't know. We don't even know what literacy was like. We suspect it was very low. We also think that, in the historiography, what you find is that children might have, spent perhaps a year in the Kutab, learned a little bit of Quran, a little bit of writing, but perhaps no more than that. And what we know for Tunisia, at least, is that there were very, very few waqfs for Kutabs. It was in general the parents who paid. So it was completely it was a family thing. It was a civil society thing. But we find very few awqaf for education, right? And when you look at state religious expenditure, in fact, education represented a small part of what the budget or the awqaf paid. It was mainly worship. That was the bulk of state religious expenditures. Today, it's the opposite. I mean, education has become the bulk, right? I think around 60% of what the state spends in terms of religious expenditures. So little waqfs and very little education in Quranic schools in villages, of course, but it doesn't mean that in the big cities, there wasn't a thriving religious culture or intellectual life.
So like for ordinary peasants or pastoralists, like what would, so even in the 19th century, what would have a Tunisian pastoralist or a Tunisian peasant, what would their religious practices look like?
Oh, in terms of religious practices, well, prayers.
Do you think people would have
Ramadan.
done the 5 prayers? Would every peasant have known how to do the 5 prayers? So, for example, recently I was interviewing a gentleman from Pakistan, and he was saying in his village in Punjab, when he was growing up, he's now 63, he was saying when he was growing up, a lot of people might not know how to do the 5 prayers. And they might just follow the leader, but they wouldn't know how to do it independently. And I found that fascinating, not knowing how to pray.
It's possible. It's very possible. But, from what I've read and what I've seen, it might have depended on villages, who the imam was. Perhaps in the cities, there was more, more guidelines also coming from more educated places about how to practice. But it's not something I have really focused on, the forms of religiosity. But going back to a question you've asked earlier, and I don't think I've answered that question about the substance of the textbooks. What is taught? It's important. It's not because you have, let's say 3.5 hours a week. These hours are not the same in Saudi Arabia and Tunisia or Morocco, right? And when I did my ethnography, I was looking for the number of hours of religious education in curricula in Tunisia. And so the data was a bit patchy. And so I went to ask people of an older generation how many hours, if they remembered. So, and I said, how many hours of Quran? I asked, especially women, like, how many hours of Quran did you have? And they looked at me, and they were together from a quite, wealthy, comfortable social class. They look at me almost like with a knee-jerk reaction. Quran? No. Ooh, we learned religion, right? So there are also like different ways to look at
what does that mean? What does that mean if you're not learning the Quran?
It meant that they didn't learn the Quran by heart, as was done in the Kutab. So a sort of specialized Islamic track, right? But they learned it in the modern school. So in a more rational way. So they learned a little bit about the Quran, but also about, civics, what it means morally to follow the Quran, etc. Right? So there was a difference for them between strictly learning the Quran by heart,
you without mean reciting versus understanding the akhlaq literature? Okay,
yes,
right, yeah,
rather than rationally understanding, and implementing it. So there are different ways, and the bodily, how would I call that? This idea that, when you learn the Quran by heart and recite it, you become the embodiment of it. This is something that was rejected completely in this type of understanding of religious education. And Bourguiba was very much like that. I mean, when he came to power after independence, he insisted on a rational and a rationalist interpretation of the Quran. And it was, reciting it was not the aim here. What was the aim was to understand what it said and to implement it in a rational way, right? So of course there is a difference between different understandings of religion, and you could have people who were, believers and did not pray because they did not want to, or they did not know how, or they didn't have time to, right?
Okay, I have a question going back to your earlier work. Why does, and this is a question I don't know the answer to, why does Al-Azhar have such global influence?
Yeah. So first, I think there is this geographical position, like, between the Maghreb and the Mashriq, between the western part of MENA and the eastern part. So you have a lot of people who converge there, for instance, to go back and forth to Mecca and then stayed. It was the attention of rulers for some time, but especially under the Ottomans. So what you have is really a very important central religious institution in the Sunni Muslim world. And what I see, in the history of Egypt, particularly in the 20th century, independently of all the fluctuations of, related to this tug of war between liberals and conservatives, is its centrality. And so, I think those different regimes in the history of Egypt could not do without Al-Azhar. It was the case under Nasser. He needed the ulama to, reject the ideology of the Muslim Brothers. Al-Azhar played a very important role during the revolution, and also Nasser really expanded it. And so it explains also its importance today. It has, as you saw on my tables, it has quite an important role in terms of enrollments, in terms of teaching, but also in terms of its normative interventions in the public square. And what I found it very interesting when I went to study at Al-Azhar in the 1990s was the extraordinary diversity of the world of ulama, right? So if there is an alliance between the ulama and the state, this diversity makes it very, very tense, very complex. And we always see the ulama of Al-Azhar, whenever they can, trying to intervene in a normative way in the public square, for instance, to ban books, for instance, to intervene on such things such as hijab or niqab, to intervene into moral and public life in many, many different ways.
Sorry, just to clarify that, when you say the diversity of the scholars at Al-Azhar, do you mean that they teach the four schools as compared to IUM that only teaches?
No, I mean political diversity. So you will find Salafis, you will find Muslim Brothers, you will have Sufis, liberals, conservatives. So in terms of where they stand on the liberal conservative axis, you will find quite an enormous diversity.
How many liberals? I mean, when we say liberals, what do we mean?
So
what's an Al-Azhar liberal?
So people who do not want to thicken the state custodianship of Islam. So are not interested in adding more Islamic constraints on governance, right? I'm not sure how many, but there are, some of them. And in fact, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar himself is, compared to conservatives like the Muslim Brothers on the liberal side. Right. So, of course, he's aligned with the regime, but he's very, very anti-Muslim Brothers. Right. So, of course, again, it depends on when you put the cursor and where you look at the divide. Right. So I don't have statistics to give you. I haven't done surveys, but the diversity is quite interesting, because before I started my ethnography, and at that time I worked, as an ethnographer and looked at printed material, but didn't do any numbers. But when I was telling people in Egypt and, colleagues in Egypt, I'm going to study Al-Azhar from a sociological point of view, they would look at me and say, why are you doing this? They're just, submitted to the regime. They have nothing to say. But in fact, I discovered that it was the opposite, that it was a very vibrant group and extremely diverse from a political point of view.
But why do you think it has such global influence? Because, for example, let's take the French example. I think, when Sarkozy wanted to ban the hijab, he asked,
Yes.
the fatwa from Al-Azhar. And,
Yeah.
all over the Muslim world, you get people wanting
Yes.
to study in Al-Azhar, people
Yes.
paying to go and study in Al-Azhar. And what do you think that comes from? Is it because, like William Graham argues that within Islamic theology, within Islamic epistemology, there's been this deep reverence for the established wisdom, for going back to tradition, for having this connection to the past, or Berkeley's got this book on how in medieval Cairo you only gained prestige as an Islamic scholar by having studied under someone who was themselves prestigious. Is it something like there's been this consolidation of authority and it's just got such high reverence within the Islamic world, and has it always just had very, very high prestige?
I think it always had very high prestige, but also in the 20th century, it has become big, much bigger than the Zaytuna or, the Qarawiyin. And the fact that there are so many ulama over there, and, it feeds itself, right? People want to go study there and they have a reverence for Al-Azhar. And in fact, this is why I wanted to study it, because it was the Sunni institution of Muslim learning. So I think also the attention that the state gave it over the 20th century. I mean, this was, something that Nasser thought about very, very with a lot of attention. I mean, he opened Al-Azhar to Africa, for instance, right? He sent ulama to Africa. Today, you have ulama of Al-Azhar who go to Saudi Arabia and also to Europe, to Africa. So it is really working as a hub. And I think the state has also facilitated that after, the second half of the 20th century. It has been part of this custodianship. And so because it had such prestige before, it continued to be used as such. And the attention, paid by different presidents over the modern history of Egypt is quite astonishing. And I think it's one of the reasons why it has remained such a central hub for Islamic learning.
Okay, so one of the key arguments in your book is that, the state has this custodianship of Islam and then funds religious education and everyone becomes more religious. So you get this positive feedback loop. But there is one country that seems to be a counterexample, and that's Saudi Arabia today, right? So they've tried to restrict and restrain the ulama. They've tried to remove some of the religion out of public education. Like, I think there are now in Saudi schools, women are teaching music. All kinds of wild things are going on in Saudi Arabia. And why do you think this is happening? Why aren't we seeing stronger backlash from the ulama? Is it just fear, under totalitarianism, or is it that the ulama are getting rent from the education systems? Saudi Arabia seems to buck your model.
Well, so first, I want to say that I don't think I argue in the book that this increased exposure to Islamic instruction makes people want more religion or more Sharia, right? I don't make that causality.
But
right?
do you not think that's
but
true?
It might.
Okay.
It might. And again, it depends on what is taught, right? And so, for instance, in Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, there were some of my colleagues who argued that the Arab Spring was due to the reform of the religious textbooks after 1989, which were much more liberal, oriented towards the Enlightenment, liberal reforms, democracy. I'm not sure I buy that, but I think it was for economic reasons. But I don't make that. I don't think I make that argument of causality. Now, for me, what's happening in Saudi Arabia is not a counterexample. It is one example of fluctuation. I mean, remember my state religious expenditures, the ones I estimated, I evaluated, they go like this, right, all the time. And this is part of the fist fight, right? And in Saudi Arabia, I think it's the same thing. It is done in a very authoritarian way, of course, right? And this is perhaps why the ulama are not saying much. We don't hear them saying much. right? But this is like a super example. On the contrary, it's like a super example of a tremendous fluctuation in the tug of war. Now, how much does it reverberate in terms of expenditures? I can't tell you because I haven't studied that. I don't have the data on Saudi Arabia, and if you have them, please share them with me. But so there are, and so what your remarks also tells me is that it would be important to continue the work I have done and expand it to other countries, and not just to the Middle East or Muslim majority countries, but any country, right? So let's take France. We know that France has like full separation, does not finance religions, but we also know that it gives tax breaks to religions, that it has chaplains in hospitals and prisons. So there must be, it has what's called the Bureau des Cultes within the Ministry of Interior that takes care of the relationship between the state and religions. So, this might be also interesting to look at when it comes to other places in the world that are not Muslim majority.
That's a great question. So what is, I'm ignorant on this. What are the primary ways of religious learning for Muslims, for French Muslims? So beyond mosques, are informal madrasas, like an after-school madrasa, is that permissible in France?
I think it is. I think people can go and take halaqat or Quranic courses in mosques. I also think there are a few Muslim schools. So private schools in France, they are different sorts. They are completely private, but there are also private schools who are under contract with the French state. So they have to teach the French public school curriculum in addition to whatever else they teach in order to receive money from the state, especially, I think, to pay teachers. If I remember well, I'm not completely sure, but one might want to verify that. And there are very few of those because the French society, I think, is not ready to see these schools develop.
Yeah, it's much more secular, much more secular. The schools have the responsibility for crafting the modern French citizen. So even though you don't make the claim of causality, I personally interpret your book as saying, if you have this big supply of religious education, that's one explanation of people becoming more religious. And I think that does have very real implications for Europe. So, for example, in the UK, we do have a lot of faith schools. Faith schools are perfectly legal, perfectly legitimate. And you may even have a government-funded faith school. And that can and within these schools, there may be gender segregation. There may be very strict lessons on piety. They'll have observers, are they teaching maths and English? Are they getting good maths and English scores? But as long as their maths and English scores are correct, in fact, just last week, we have this Ofsted, which is our inspector of schools, inspector of educational standards, and the person who's been appointed is in charge of British educational standards. Himself runs a number of Muslim schools that are very successful educationally. But I think your book has very strong implications that, if you permit faith schools, don't be surprised if people become very, very religious.
Yeah.
That said, sorry.
No, it could be also so two remarks on that. You're right. So this is an assumption that we can make. Causality is always difficult to verify, right? But it is, of course, one possible implication. Another one is that this happens because people are religious, right? And they want more. So there are two directions in which this could go. Now, the other thing is that, so we see more exposure, but it's very possible that the quality of that instruction has changed. So basically, or, even what's happening in mosques. So imams are now more educated. Teachers of education are also more educated. They don't have PhDs, but they have masters and things like that. There are specific masters in Tunisia for imams now, etc. So what could also say, well, it's not that it's more, in terms of money, but it's more in terms of quality. And so maybe, and that's a maybe, it's an assumption too, has what the substance of that exposure, has that changed, right? That's also, taking us in a different direction, but it's also a possibility. These are things I haven't developed in the book because I had to stop somewhere, and but they are possible and fascinating implications. And by the way, these implications exist whether you do it from with the civil society or with the state, right? Doesn't matter in the end who does it, right?
No, I absolutely, and I think as you see improvements in technological connectivity, there are so many other opportunities for religious learning, whether it's looking at Arab sermons on TikTok. Here in the UK, we have this TV channel called like the Islam channel, and you can watch all the scholars there are from Al-Azhar, incidentally. So yeah, there are many different ways of connectivity now. So it doesn't necessarily have to have in the classroom. And talking of the, I would bet a lot of money that if you replicated your analysis in Indonesia and Malaysia, you'd find exactly the same thing, right? In the 1970s, they were mandating religious instruction. They were devoting a larger share of it. So my prediction is that what you say of the Middle East is true of the whole Islamic world. I'm very, very convinced by your argument. I really, really appreciated your book so much. I'm such a massive fan. I mean, you've done so much in terms of carefully getting all that data, building this massive data set. It's a tremendous amount of work.
Thank you. Yeah, it means a lot to me. Thanks.
No, truly. It is just, I just want everyone to look at your tables. That is all I want. They're like 8 tables, but they're like godly, right? Anyway. Professor Zeghal, thank you so much for your time, for your scholarship. This has really been educational and enlightening, and I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. That was wonderful.
Awesome. All right, if you stay on the line, now what we do is we stop the recording and